It was just another quiet morning in the small town of Whitford. The sun was low in the sky, casting soft light over the streets as the sound of birds filled the air. James Carter, a middle-aged black man with a strong build and a reserved demeanor, had just left his modest home to run a few errands. He was a senior judge at the Whitford District Court, a position that demanded both respect and attention. But for James, it was just another day of blending into the background of a town that he had lived in for over 20 years. His role in the community was important, but it wasn't something he often advertised. Most people didn't recognize him on the street. He wasn't the kind of person to stand out, despite the powerful position he held. As James walked down Main Street toward the grocery store, he thought about his day ahead. The simple tasks he had planned, getting some supplies for his family and maybe grabbing a coffee, felt far from extraordinary. But that would change in a matter of minutes. He turned the corner, heading toward the intersection where the local coffee shop sat. The streets were still fairly empty, save for a few early risers and business owners setting up for the day. His steps were purposeful, and the weight of his black leather briefcase seemed to add a rhythm to the pace. It wasn't much, but it was enough to help him stay grounded. Suddenly, a police car pulled up next to him, the engine growling loudly as it came to a stop. James barely took notice at first. It wasn't uncommon to see officers patrolling this part of town. However, as the car's window rolled down and the officer inside called out to him, James felt a slight tension in the air. "Hey there. You got a minute?" the officer asked, his voice filled with a certain nonchalance. The officer was a young man, in his late 20s, wearing a slightly too tight uniform that seemed to fit awkwardly around his frame. Behind the wheel was another officer, older, but still wearing a grin as though this was all just part of a routine. James stopped in his tracks, raising an eyebrow as he glanced at the officer. He didn't recognize either of them, but it was still common for him to have polite interactions with law enforcement when he was in town. The town wasn't large, and most officers knew the regular faces. "Sure," James responded, his voice calm and even. "Is there a problem, officer?" The young cop leaned out of the window, his expression now more casual than professional. "No problem, just wondering what you're up to this morning." "You know, it's pretty early for someone to be out walking around," he said, as if that was reason enough to stop someone. James felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise, but he didn't show it. This wasn't the first time he'd encountered unnecessary stops on the street. Often, it was a case of someone being racially profiled or treated with suspicion without reason. Still, James was used to navigating these moments with grace. He had spent years on the bench, making judgments in court, often dealing with more volatile situations, so a simple street encounter like this was nothing new. "I'm just heading to the store," James replied, maintaining his composure. The officer didn't respond immediately. He glanced over at his partner in the passenger seat, and they exchanged a brief look before both officers burst out laughing. "Well, it's a pretty nice morning to be out and about. We thought we'd check out what you're up to." "A man walking alone at this hour, pretty unusual, right?" the officer said with a smirk, clearly amused by what he assumed was the absurdity of the situation. James felt his patience wearing thin. He could feel the unease creeping in as the officers seemed to find humor in what was clearly an uncomfortable situation. It wasn't lost on him that he was being treated differently, not just because of the time of day, but because of the color of his skin. Before he could respond, the second officer leaned forward and added, "You know, we're just making sure everyone's safe. You wouldn't want to be out here alone if things went sideways." The comment, intended as a casual joke, hung in the air like an accusation. James's eyes narrowed slightly, but he remained silent, his mind racing with thoughts of how to handle this. Should he challenge them outright? Should he walk away, hoping they'd leave him alone? He knew the consequences of either choice could spiral quickly. He had heard enough stories to know how quickly things could go from seemingly harmless to dangerous in situations like this. Finally, the young officer leaned back in his seat and put on a smile, as if the encounter had been nothing more than a playful exchange between strangers. All right, we're just messing with you," he said, the humor still evident in his voice. "Take care, mister." James nodded politely, relieved that the encounter seemed to be over, but a deep sense of discomfort lingered. He knew something wasn't right. As he turned and continued on his way, he tried to shake off the uneasy feeling, telling himself that maybe he was just overthinking things. But as he walked, he couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if the officers had asked the same questions to someone else. If they'd stopped someone who wasn't a black man, would they have treated them the same way? Would they have found the same amusement in their questions? James didn't know it yet, but this brief moment on the street would become the tipping point for something far more profound. He hadn't revealed his identity, and the officers had no idea who he was. But what if they had? Would they have treated him the same way, or would they have suddenly shown him a level of respect they hadn't before? As James approached the grocery store, he tried to put the encounter behind him. But deep down, he knew something had shifted. What he didn't know was that this small incident was about to snowball into a life-altering situation, one that would test not only his integrity but the integrity of the very community he'd dedicated his life to serving. It was just another morning in Whitford, but the storm was already on the horizon. As James entered the grocery store, the feeling of unease continued to settle in his chest, though he tried to push it aside. He walked through the aisles, selecting items for the week, bananas, eggs, milk, but his mind kept drifting back to the encounter. He knew he couldn't let it consume him. After all, he had dealt with far more complex situations in his role as a judge. But this felt different. It wasn't the first time he'd faced casual racism in his life, but the way the officers had treated him, so lightheartedly, as though he was a joke, made it feel more personal. As James rounded the corner to the checkout lane, the familiar sound of the doorbell above the entrance signaled the arrival of someone new. He glanced up and froze when he saw the same two officers walk in, laughing and joking between themselves. They clearly hadn't expected to see him again so soon. The young officer, who had initiated the stop earlier, noticed James right away and gave him a wave. His voice was loud enough for everyone in the store to hear. "Hey, Judge Carter. You still need anything from here?" The way he said Judge Carter sounded mocking, as if testing the waters for a reaction, like it was an afterthought, a way to punctuate the awkwardness of their earlier exchange. James didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood there, scanning the aisles, pretending not to hear. He knew what they were doing. They were waiting for him to respond, to acknowledge them. It was a subtle power move. The older officer, who had remained mostly quiet earlier, now joined in. "Yeah, didn't think we'd run into you again. What's it like being a judge, anyway? Bet you see all kinds of things in your courtroom." The officer's voice was dripping with sarcasm, as though he was trying to downplay James's position, reducing him to a stereotype. James felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He kept his gaze steady, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a response. Instead, he finished scanning his groceries and started heading toward the self-checkout, silently hoping they would lose interest and leave him alone. But the young officer wasn't done. "You know," he called out loudly, "it's kind of funny, we were just talking about how some folks around here think they're above the law. Guess that includes people like you, huh?" He said it with an air of superiority, as if James had somehow stepped out of line just by being a black man in this town, by existing in their space. The remark hit James harder than he expected. His hand tightened around the handle of his cart, his pulse quickening. But he refused to let them see that it had affected him. He finished paying for his groceries with calm precision, determined not to let them escalate the situation any further. He didn't want to make a scene, didn't want to be the one to add fuel to the fire. He simply wanted to go home, put the day behind him, and move on. But as he stepped toward the door, the young officer spoke again, this time louder, almost as if daring him to respond. You know, there's a lot of people around here who don't appreciate someone like you walking around, thinking you're better than everyone else. What do you think of that, Judge?" The comment was loaded, and the aggression in his tone was unmistakable. This time, James stopped in his tracks. His heart pounded in his chest, and for a split second, his mind raced with every option available to him. He could walk away. He could tell the officer that he had better things to do than entertain petty remarks. But a fire was beginning to build inside him. He wasn't just some random man off the street. He was a judge. A man who had dedicated his life to upholding the law, someone who had earned his position through years of hard work, integrity, and sacrifice. And here they were, mocking him, disrespecting him because of his skin color. For a moment, everything went silent. The noise of the store faded into the background, and all he could hear was the rhythmic beat of his own heart. He turned around slowly, facing the officer. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, but the weight of his words cut through the tension in the room. "You're right. I am a judge. And I've spent my career making sure people like you understand the importance of respect for others, the importance of the law. But let me make one thing clear. Just because I wear a suit and hold a title doesn't mean I'm above the law. It means I understand it better than most." The officer's smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure, stepping closer, trying to regain control of the situation. "Oh, really? So, you think you're some kind of moral authority here?" The young officer's voice was growing more aggressive, more defensive, as if the momentary challenge to his authority had shaken him. James held his ground. He could feel the eyes of the other shoppers on him now, but he didn't care. He wasn't backing down. "No, I don't think I'm a moral authority," James said, his voice firm. "I think I'm just a man who knows when something isn't right. And what's happening right now? This isn't right." The older officer stepped in, trying to defuse the situation. "All right, that's enough," he said, placing a hand on the young officer's shoulder. "Let's just go." But it was too late. James knew he couldn't just walk away from this anymore. Not without making a point. Not without standing up for himself and for everyone who had ever been treated like this. "I'm not going anywhere," James said, his voice now cutting through the tension. "You're going to hear me out. I've put up with years of these games, these little power plays. You don't know who I am or what I stand for. But I'm telling you right now, this stops now." The young officer's face reddened with frustration, but he didn't respond. The older officer was clearly uncomfortable now, his demeanor shifting. But James was resolute. The confrontation had escalated to a point where it couldn't just be brushed off. He could feel the weight of the moment, the significance of what was unfolding in front of him. And in that instant, he knew his life would never be the same. What had started as a casual, unnecessary stop on the street had now become something much larger, something that was about to change everything. With the young officer still seething, James turned and walked out of the store, his groceries in hand, but his mind racing. The officers didn't follow him this time. They'd made their point, and he'd made his. But the battle was far from over. This wasn't just about an interaction at the grocery store anymore. This was about something much bigger. And James was ready to face whatever came next. The drive back home was quiet, almost eerie in its stillness. James had barely turned on the radio as he drove through the familiar streets of Whitford, each intersection and storefront blurring past him in a haze. His thoughts were racing, conflicting emotions battling for control. His hands gripped the steering wheel with a tightness that had nothing to do with the road ahead. The incident at the store kept replaying in his mind, the mocking tone of the young officer's voice echoing like a bad tune he couldn't shake off. The moment when he had stood up to them felt like a fleeting victory, but it came with a heavy price. He knew he hadn't just challenged their behavior, he'd unknowingly challenged something larger, something deeper rooted in the town's unspoken social order. And though he hadn't expected it, the ramifications of what had just occurred were starting to unfold in ways he hadn't anticipated. As he turned onto his street, James saw a small crowd gathered near his front yard. His heart skipped a beat, a sharp pang of worry hitting him as he pulled into his driveway. The group was a mix of neighbors and familiar faces, all standing in small clusters, whispering amongst themselves. The sight made his stomach churn, but he forced himself to stay calm. It wasn't unusual for people to stop by during the day, but this many at once? This wasn't a normal visit. Stepping out of his car, he could feel the weight of the stares directed his way, the momentary silence that fell over the crowd when they saw him. It was as if the entire town knew about the encounter, even though it had only just happened. One of his neighbors, Linda Harris, an older woman who had lived in the house next door for as long as he could remember, approached him first. Her expression was a mix of concern and something else, something he couldn't quite place. "James, we heard about what happened. Are you okay?" she asked, her voice quiet but carrying a hint of something more than just worry. She seemed hesitant, unsure of how to approach the situation, and that hesitation made James uneasy. "I'm fine, Linda," he said, his tone more curt than he intended, but he didn't want to get into it right now. He had enough on his plate without explaining the situation to every neighbor in town. Just a little interaction with the officers. Nothing to worry about. But Linda didn't back off. "James, people are talking. You need to know that. There's a lot of buzz around here. Folks are upset, not just about what happened, but about how it might be affecting the whole town." She paused before adding, "The way they treated you, the way they spoke to you, it's not right. And you know it's not just about the officers, right? This whole thing runs deeper." James looked at her, his mind spinning. He hadn't expected to hear this. Not here. Not from Linda. She wasn't the type to engage in controversial topics. But there it was, plain as day, word had already spread. The town was buzzing about what had happened. And for the first time, James realized that what had started as a personal encounter on a quiet street had now become a public issue. Before he could respond, another neighbor, a middle-aged man named Dave, spoke up from the crowd. "James, we know you've always kept your head down, done your job with integrity. But this? This is something else. Those officers, what they did to you wasn't just an isolated incident. People are talking about it all over town. There are whispers that maybe this is a sign of something bigger. You've seen the tension around here. You've seen how things have been shifting. This could be the tipping point, man." James felt a chill run down his spine. He had always known that Whitford wasn't perfect. He had witnessed the subtle undercurrents of tension, the quiet racism that bubbled beneath the surface of everyday life. But he never thought it would spill over like this, not in his own backyard, not in a town where he had worked tirelessly to make a difference. He had been too focused on his career, too determined to play the role of the calm, measured judge. But now it was clear, this was bigger than him. It wasn't just about him and the officers anymore. It was about a community grappling with something far more dangerous. "What do you mean by that?" James asked, his voice quieter now, more thoughtful. He had been on the bench long enough to know when to listen and when to speak. Now, he needed to understand what was really going on in the minds of those around him. Dave shifted uncomfortably, clearly reluctant to speak openly in front of the crowd, but he could feel the weight of the moment. "People are saying the officers were just the tip of the iceberg. That this kind of behavior, racism, intimidation, has been growing in Whitford. Maybe it's always been here, but it's starting to show more, starting to affect everyone." Another voice chimed in from the crowd, a woman named Sarah, who worked at the local diner. "There have been rumors about police misconduct for months now. People have seen things, heard things, but no one wanted to say anything. Everyone was afraid to speak up. But what happened to you, James? That's the spark. It's opening up old wounds that a lot of people thought had healed. James felt his pulse quicken. His mind was racing now, trying to piece together everything that was happening. He had always believed that he was a part of the solution, that by doing his job as a judge, he could help bring about change, that justice would prevail. But now, it seemed as if his own role in the community was being questioned, that everything he had worked for was unraveling before his eyes. "James," Linda said, her voice softer now, almost pleading, "you need to do something. People are looking to you. You're a judge, you're respected here, and people know that. But if you don't stand up now, if you don't say something, it's going to get worse. You can't let this just go away." For the first time since the encounter, James felt the weight of the moment truly sink in. It wasn't just about him anymore. It wasn't just a single altercation with two officers. This was a reckoning, a moment of truth for the entire town of Whitford. And he had to decide whether he was going to be a bystander or whether he would be the one to finally confront the town's darkest truths. As the neighbors slowly dispersed, leaving him with his thoughts, James stood still in his driveway, feeling the full impact of what had just transpired. The silence that followed was deafening. He knew what he had to do. He couldn't remain neutral in this battle. He couldn't be silent. He had a responsibility, not just as a judge, but as a member of this community, to step up and address the injustice that was staring him in the face. The question now wasn't whether he was ready to confront the truth, it was whether the town was ready to face it with him. James walked into his house, the door closing behind him with a soft click, and for the first time in years, he felt the heavy weight of history pressing down on him. This was only the beginning, and the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. But one thing was clear, the truth had been unleashed, and there was no turning back. That night, James sat at his kitchen table, his eyes fixed on the stack of case files before him, but his mind was far from the law. He could feel the weight of the decision he had to make pressing on him. His fingers drummed against the wooden surface absent-mindedly, the steady rhythm almost calming, but inside, a storm was brewing. He had never felt so torn between his sense of duty and his sense of justice. His role as a judge had always been about impartiality, about upholding the law without letting personal feelings interfere. But this was different. This wasn't a case in his courtroom. This was real life. And it wasn't just his life on the line, it was the life of an entire community. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the problem wasn't confined to a few rogue officers. The issue was systemic, embedded in the very fabric of Whitford. The officers' actions had been a symptom of something much larger. The whispers that had been floating around the town for months, the small but consistent incidents of racial tension, the way certain groups seemed to receive preferential treatment, it all pointed to a deeper, unspoken truth: Whitford was a town divided, and no one was willing to acknowledge it. He ran his hand through his hair, letting out a long sigh. His thoughts kept returning to Linda's words. "People are looking to you." They echoed in his mind like a mantra. He had always thought of himself as someone who led by example, who worked behind the scenes to make change happen quietly, effectively. But now, it was clear that a quiet approach wouldn't work. This wasn't something that could be fixed with a few rulings in his courtroom or by quietly addressing grievances in private. No, this was a battle for the soul of Whitford, and if he wanted to change things, he couldn't do it from the shadows. He had to step into the light, whether he was ready or not. The decision weighed heavily on him. On one hand, he could do nothing. He could let the storm pass, wait for the outrage to subside, and hope that the town would forget the incident with the officers. Maybe it would fade away. It wasn't the first time something like this had happened, after all. Whitford had a way of letting things slide under the radar. But James knew that wasn't an option. He couldn't let this moment pass. He had seen firsthand how silence could perpetuate injustice, how turning a blind eye allowed toxic behaviors to fester and grow. If he didn't act now, things would only get worse. The other option was far more complicated. Speaking out meant putting himself in the line of fire. He could be criticized, vilified, even ostracized by some of his own neighbors. There would be backlash, there was no doubt about that. The police department had friends in high places, and Whitford had long been a town where certain people, certain families, held the power. James had never been part of the old guard, the families who ran the town from the shadows. His rise to power had been through hard work, a clean record, and a reputation for fairness. But in times like these, reputation alone wasn't enough. He needed to make a stand, and that meant risking everything. As the clock ticked on, James mulled over the possibilities, his gaze drifting to the family portrait on the wall. His wife, Miriam, was smiling in the photo, their 2 children sitting beside her, all of them happy and unaware of the weight he was carrying. Miriam had always been his rock, the person he turned to when he needed guidance, but she was also someone who understood the importance of justice, of doing what was right, no matter the cost. He knew that she would support him no matter what decision he made. But would she understand the gravity of what lay ahead? Would his children understand the sacrifices that would come with this decision? The thought of exposing them to the ugliness of the situation, of seeing them caught in the crossfire of his fight for justice, made his stomach turn. Still, the feeling that something had to be done, that he couldn't stay silent, gnawed at him. He stood up, pacing the room, his mind working at full speed. The more he thought about it, the more he realized he couldn't ignore the cries for help from his neighbors, from the people who were watching and waiting for someone to stand up. This wasn't just about his personal integrity, it was about the future of the community he loved. By the time the first light of dawn began to creep through the blinds, James had made up his mind. He would speak out. He would take a stand against the system that allowed such blatant disregard for human dignity to flourish, even if it meant losing everything he had worked for. He wasn't sure how he would do it or where to begin, but he knew that this was a turning point. The next steps wouldn't be easy, but they were necessary. The weight of his decision sat heavily on him as he sat back down at the kitchen table, the sense of finality in the air. His career, his reputation, even his safety, all of it would be on the line. But he had come to realize that his position as a judge wasn't just about interpreting the law, it was about shaping the moral compass of the community. And that compass had veered too far off course. He grabbed his phone from the table, his fingers hovering over the screen. For a moment, he considered calling Miriam. But then he thought better of it. She had been his partner in all things for so many years, and he knew she would support him, but this was a decision he needed to make alone. He was going to have to fight this battle with his own strength, and if he was going to ask others to follow him, he had to be willing to lead by example. James opened the messaging app and began typing out a message. It was addressed to the town council, to the mayor, to anyone who could help make a change. It wasn't a message of anger or accusation, rather, it was one of accountability. He wasn't calling for riots or protests. He wasn't calling for violence. What he was calling for was a conversation. A serious, open conversation about race, about power, about justice, and about the kind of community Whitford wanted to be. The message was simple but powerful: the time for silence is over. We must address the issues of inequality that have festered in our community. We must stand together and work toward a more just future. If not now, when? He sent the message and put the phone down, a sense of finality washing over him. There was no turning back now. The road ahead would be difficult, but James knew it was the right one. This was his moment to change things, not just for himself, but for his family, his neighbors, and the entire town of Whitford. And for the first time in a long time, James felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something better. The next few days were a whirlwind. The message James had sent to the town council had spread like wildfire. What had begun as a personal plea for accountability soon snowballed into a larger movement. It didn't take long for his words to reach the local media, and before he knew it, reporters were knocking at his door, demanding answers. The story of the altercation with the officers had become the talk of the town, but now it was something bigger, a rallying cry for a community divided by deep-rooted issues of race and inequality. James had always been a private person. He didn't seek attention, never wanted to be in the spotlight. But now, the spotlight was unavoidable. He found himself at the center of a storm, one that he hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore. Every conversation he had was charged with tension. Some neighbors praised him for his courage, for daring to speak up. Others condemned him, accusing him of stirring up trouble where there had been none. There were whispers behind closed doors and stares when he walked down the street. For the first time in years, James realized he was no longer the quiet, respected judge in the community. He was a symbol, a lightning rod for all the town's unspoken grievances and frustrations. It was a Thursday afternoon when things took a turn. James had just returned from the courthouse when his phone rang. It was Miriam. Her voice was strained, and James immediately knew something was wrong. "James, you need to come home. Now," she said, her voice sharp with urgency. He didn't ask questions. He grabbed his coat and rushed out the door, heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea what was waiting for him at home, but the tone in Miriam's voice told him it wasn't good. When he arrived, he found Miriam standing in the driveway, her arms crossed over her chest, looking as though she had been waiting for him for hours. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with disbelief. "What happened?" James asked, stepping out of the car, but he could already see the answer in her eyes. "There's been a protest," Miriam said, her voice trembling. "Outside the police station. It started as a peaceful rally, but it got out of hand. There were rumors that some of the protesters were violent, and now the whole town is in chaos. People are scared, James. They're looking for someone to blame, and they're blaming you." The air seemed to leave his lungs as James processed her words. He knew the town was on edge, but he hadn't expected things to escalate this quickly. A protest had always seemed like a distant possibility, something that could happen weeks, maybe months down the line. But now, here it was, unfolding before him with all the fury of a powder keg ready to explode. "Where are the kids?" James asked, his mind racing. "Inside," Miriam replied. "I've locked the doors, but there's already talk of people coming by the house. They're angry, James. They want someone to pay." James felt a wave of guilt and fear crash over him. This wasn't the world he had wanted to create. This wasn't the change he had envisioned. His decision to speak out had ignited something he wasn't prepared for. He had hoped to shine a light on the town's flaws, to open a dialogue that would lead to healing, not to violence and division. But now, the reality was much harsher. The streets were filled with people, his neighbors, people he had lived alongside for years, who were shouting, demanding justice, but also demanding someone to hold responsible. And in their eyes, that someone was him. Without saying another word, he turned and headed into the house. His mind was racing, processing everything that had happened, trying to figure out how to fix the damage. He had to make things right. The idea of a peaceful conversation about race, justice, and power seemed so distant now. What had started as a plea for unity had fractured into something unrecognizable. And though James had made his stand for justice, he couldn't help but wonder if he had set in motion forces that were beyond his control. Miriam followed him into the living room, her eyes full of concern. "James, what are we going to do? People are showing up at the courthouse now too. Some of the officers are getting involved. The tension is so thick, it's suffocating." He didn't answer immediately. He paced back and forth, his thoughts consumed by the whirlwind around him. Then, as if a light bulb went off in his mind, he stopped, his eyes narrowing in thought. "We need to speak to them. To the people. Not just the council or the police, everyone. The people who are out there on the streets protesting. The ones who are angry. We can't solve this with silence or with more violence. Miriam's face softened, but there was still a hint of fear in her eyes. James, you don't know what's going to happen out there. It's too dangerous. People are furious. I know, he said, his voice steady now, filled with a sense of purpose. But if we don't do something, this will only get worse. I can't sit back and let the town tear itself apart. We need to find a way to bring people together. The idea of confronting the protesters, of standing before the angry crowd, was terrifying, but James knew that if he didn't take this step, the town would remain locked in a spiral of hatred and fear. He couldn't let it happen. He had to try. Later that afternoon, James made his way to the courthouse, where the situation had escalated. The streets were filled with protesters, some chanting, others holding signs. There was a palpable tension in the air, and as James made his way to the front of the crowd, he could feel the heat of the anger directed at him. They didn't care who he was, what his role in the community had been. To them, he was the face of the system that had oppressed them for so long. He stepped up to the microphone, and the crowd fell into a hesitant silence. James took a deep breath, looking out at the sea of faces before him. I know you're angry, he began, his voice firm but calm. I know you feel betrayed, that the system has failed you. But I am here to tell you that I stand with you. I stand with all of you who have been wronged by those who are supposed to protect us. This fight is not over. It is just beginning. The crowd was still, the words hanging in the air like a fragile thread. But as James continued to speak, something shifted. Slowly, a few people began to nod, others murmured in agreement. The anger was still there, but now there was something else, a glimmer of hope, a small light shining through the darkness. By the end of his speech, James had managed to shift the mood, if only slightly. People weren't throwing rocks or yelling insults anymore. Instead, they were listening. For the first time in weeks, the town seemed to take a collective breath. It wasn't a resolution, not yet. But it was a beginning. A chance at reconciliation, at dialogue. James didn't know what the future would hold, but in that moment, he felt the first stirrings of change. As he left the courthouse, Miriam waiting for him by the car, he knew there was still much work to be done. The road ahead would be difficult, and the wounds in Whitford would take time to heal. But James also knew one thing for sure, he had made the right choice. Change, real change, had to start somewhere, and today, it had started with him. The days that followed were filled with tension, uncertainty, and, for James, a growing sense of exhaustion. He had expected the aftermath of his decision to be difficult, but he hadn't anticipated how much it would take out of him. Every conversation, every interaction seemed to carry the weight of his choice. The protests continued, some peaceful, others filled with anger. Social media exploded with opinions, some in support of James, others condemning him for stirring up trouble. The town was divided, and James could feel it in every corner of Whitford. The lines had been drawn, and there was no way to avoid the consequences of choosing a side. He spent long hours at the courthouse, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy in the midst of the chaos. But the truth was, normalcy was slipping away, and James wasn't sure how to get it back. Every time he sat in his office, the phone rang with new messages, new demands, new questions. There were calls from the police chief, from council members, from community leaders, all asking him for clarification, for his thoughts, for his next move. But James wasn't sure what that move was. He had made his stand, but the road ahead was murky, uncertain. Meanwhile, the protests outside the courthouse began to grow larger. There were rumors of more planned demonstrations, and whispers about possible confrontations with the police. James knew that the moment of reckoning was coming, his decision would either spark real change or drive the town deeper into division. He couldn't afford to back down now, not when so many people had already taken up the fight. But there was a part of him that feared what would happen next, the toll it would take on the community and on him personally. One evening, after a particularly long day at the courthouse, James walked into his home, the familiar creak of the front door the only sound breaking the silence. Miriam was sitting at the kitchen table, her hands clasped together in front of her. Her expression was somber, and when James sat down across from her, she didn't speak right away. She just stared at him, as though trying to read him, trying to understand the weight of the choice he had made. "You're exhausted," she finally said, her voice quiet but full of concern. "And I can see it in your eyes. You're not just fighting the town anymore, James. You're fighting yourself." James let out a long sigh, rubbing his face with his hands. He had been fighting for days, fighting for justice, fighting for the truth, fighting to make things right. But the truth was, the fight was taking a toll on him, and the further he went, the more he realized how little control he had over the outcome. "I don't know how much longer I can keep this up," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I made the decision because I believed in it, because I thought it was the right thing to do. But now I'm not so sure." Miriam reached across the table, her hand finding his. "You don't have to carry this alone, James. You never have. We'll get through this together. But you need to take care of yourself, too. Whatever happens, we'll face it as a family." Her words were a comfort, but they didn't erase the fear that had settled in James's chest. There were so many unknowns. What if the protests escalated into something worse? What if the town never healed from the rift that had opened up? What if his actions led to even more division, more anger, more violence? And most terrifying of all, what if his family became a target? The thought of Miriam and the kids caught in the crossfire was enough to make him reconsider everything. The next morning, James woke up early, as he had for years, but this time, the quiet of the morning did nothing to calm his restless thoughts. He went through the motions of getting ready for the day, showering, dressing, eating, but everything felt distant, as though he were operating on autopilot. It wasn't just the weight of his decision that was wearing on him, it was the pressure of the choices yet to come. Whitford was no longer a town of familiar faces and routine, it had become a battleground, and James was at the center of it. His decision had sparked something that couldn't be undone, and now, all he could do was hope that the path forward would lead to healing, not destruction. Later that day, James attended a town hall meeting. It was a gathering of both leaders and ordinary citizens, and it was the first opportunity he had to speak directly to the people who had been divided by his actions. As he walked into the room, he felt the eyes of everyone on him, some full of hope, others full of suspicion. The air was thick with tension, and for the first time in a long while, James felt the weight of his position like an anchor pulling him down. He was introduced as the guest speaker, and when he took the stage, he was met with silence. No cheers, no applause, just the heavy, expectant silence of a crowd waiting for answers. James cleared his throat, trying to steady his nerves. He had made a commitment to speak the truth, but the truth was complicated, messy, and far from easy to digest. "I know you're angry," James began, his voice steady but filled with the strain of the moment. "And I know that my words, my actions have caused a rift. I did not come here to make things worse. I came here because I believe, in my heart, that this town is better than the division we've been living with. But that change starts with all of us. It starts with a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths." As he spoke, he noticed a subtle shift in the room. Some people leaned forward, their eyes locked on him. Others remained skeptical, arms crossed, unsure of where this conversation was headed. But for the first time in weeks, James felt like he was connecting with the crowd. Not everyone agreed with him, but that was okay. He wasn't asking for unanimous support, he was asking for a chance to move forward together. "The road ahead won't be easy," he continued, his voice rising with conviction. "But we cannot keep pretending that the issues we're facing don't exist. We have to face them, together. This is our chance to do better, to be better." The room remained silent for a long moment, and then, almost imperceptibly, one person clapped. Slowly, others joined in. The applause wasn't loud or boisterous, but it was a start. It was a sign that people were beginning to listen, beginning to recognize that change was possible, even if they didn't agree with every part of James's message. After the meeting, James walked out of the hall with Miriam by his side. The tension was still there, but for the first time, he felt like they had taken a small step toward healing. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning. The path ahead would be long, and the challenges would be great. But as he looked at Miriam, he realized something important. No matter how hard the road ahead might be, they were in it together. And together, they could face whatever came next. The fight for justice, for unity, wasn't over. But for the first time in weeks, James felt a sense of hope flicker inside him. It was a long road ahead, but maybe, just maybe, they were on the right track. The question remained, would the town of Whitford come together, or would the divisions run too deep? Only time would tell.